right, so you guys probably weren't expecting to see two of us up here today. Normally we go through and it's just one teacher, and we've been going back and forth between Exodus and Matthew. And so Exodus 4 was scheduled for today, but just because of the change in venue and knew that some people weren't going to be able to make it, we thought we'd take advantage of the situation and kind of do a review and try to re-emphasize some themes and some points that we're trying to bring out of this Exodus study. And so that's what we're going to do today. And then we'll have a couple questions at the end, some kind of things to kind of really draw out some major things that are being communicated through the text. And so to start, I guess we kind of decided we want to do a quick review on how we got to where we are in Exodus. Like, how did we get here? How did the people of Israel find itself in this situation with the Egyptians? Anybody want to speak to that?
There was a famine.
Yeah.
And food was in Egypt. Let's go to Egypt then.
That's right. And why was there food in Egypt?
Joe.
Joe? Old Joe? Yeah. Joseph. That's right. Yeah, and so we know the story about Joseph and his brothers, and how they were envious of him because he was favored by Jacob, and he had his colorful coat, and he had some weird dreams that I probably wouldn't share those dreams with my brothers if I knew it was good for me, but he did anyways, and so well, let's get rid of this guy, and they wanted to kill him at first, but then Reuben said no, don't do that. And they ended up just selling him, right? Made his way to Egypt. He lived as a servant to Potiphar. We know the story there. He became highly regarded among the servants there. And then Potiphar's wife had eyes for him and decided to, solicit, make advances. He refused, and then she made up a story to her husband that he came on to me, whatever, however you want to put that in the most biblical terms. Back in the jail, then there's the baker and the cupbearer, has the two dreams. They both come true. Like, he interprets their dreams, they both come true. The baker's beheaded, cupbearer is restored to his position, right? But the cupbearer forgets to tell Pharaoh about this guy who told him that this would happen. Until later, Pharaoh has some dreams, and it's the cows. There's like the sickly cows, and they eat the healthy cows. And Joseph goes and the cupbearer remembers. Oh yeah, there's this guy, and he told me my dreaming, and it occurred exactly as he said. Right. So then Pharaoh brings him up. Joseph interprets his dream, and then he's so impressed that he makes Joseph basically his right-hand man, second in command. Right, second only to Pharaoh. Right, and in an ironic twist, who does Joseph end up getting as his wife? Now, I don't know for sure. It seems it could be, but it's the daughter of Potipharus, which is interesting. Is that Potiphar's wife's daughter? I don't know. I tried looking into that, and some have said that, yeah, that's it, which is very ironic to me, given that the wife made advances on him. It's like, well, he ended up marrying her daughter. If that's true, that's interesting, and a little bit of providential irony. And providential irony is something that you see throughout Genesis and Exodus quite a bit. But before we get into that stuff, I want to bring our attention back to some things prior to Joseph. Because as we see in this text, there's a continual callback to the patriarchs, right? I am the God of your fathers, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, right? The continual callback. And why is that significant? Well, because of the promises that God made, right? He's made these promises, and now he's coming good on them. And we see back in Genesis 15, the Abrahamic promise in verse 1, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, do not fear, Abram, I am a shield to you. Your reward will be very great. Abram said, O Lord, what will you give me, since I am childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, Since ye have no offspring to me, one born in my house is my heir. Then behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, The man will not be your heir, but one who will come forth from your own body, he shall be your heir. And he took him outside and said, Now look toward the heavens, and count the stars, if you are able to count them. And he said to him, So shall your descendants be. Then he believed in the Lord, and he, that is the Lord, reckoned it to him as righteousness. Then continuing on to verse 12, it says, Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram. Behold, terror and great darkness fell upon him. God said to Abram, Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. But I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You will be buried at a good old age, that in the 4th generation they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. So we see a couple things here going on. We see one, this characterization of Abram as being reckoned as righteous. Why is he righteous in God's sight? Faith, belief, right? And so you see this connection between righteousness and faith, right? And this carries throughout the entire Pentateuch, at least up until Exodus 19, where we find that no longer, and TC will probably bring this up again later, no longer is faith regarded or discussed in a positive sense, because the people just unbelieve. They constantly unbelieve, so that, okay, you're going to keep this, you're not going to believe in me, here's the law. We see in Exodus 19 the law is given. But we see this characterization of Abram as righteous. And if you ever want to just jump in, and feel free to.
You're doing great.
We worked this out
You're doing great.
to where I'm going to hand it off to him at some point, but he might have something to say.
We may not get there.
It's like, oh, it's lunchtime. Sorry. Now, real quick, if you would, turn to Genesis 26. I should have had it here, but I don't. So turn to Genesis 26.
Before you say that, you remember Jeff brought it up because he did an introduction to the Pentateuch, and then I did the introduction to Exodus, and both of us brought it up. There was a point we were trying to make that we think the author of the Pentateuch, Moses, he's making a comparison between two people. Does anybody remember who the comparison's between? Abraham and Moses. So it seems like because Abraham and his family is only really mentioned from like chapter 12 to 50, and then Moses has got Exodus through Deuteronomy, it would seem as though the Pentateuch is about Moses because it takes up more room, when in reality, if you take out all of the law and you just have the narrative portion of the Pentateuch, Moses' narrative portion takes up about 20% of the Pentateuch, and Abraham and his family takes up about 20% of the Pentateuch. So narratively, throughout the Pentateuch, Abraham and Moses have equal amount of time. And what Levi's about to point out is this comparison between someone who came before the law, Abraham, is considered righteous, and then someone under the law who delivered the law to the Israelites is said to have not believed. And of course, the disclaimer being, Moses is mentioned in Hebrews 11. He's in heaven. He had faith in God. But it's a literary device that I think Moses himself is using to point out that you cannot be righteous through the law. Moses is set up as someone he sets himself up as someone who did not believe. In Numbers, it's the reason why he can't go into the promised land is when he struck the rock and he yelled at the Israelites, God says, you will not enter the promised land because you did not believe, right? That's his reason for it. We try to
He says it
connect
to Aaron as well.
Yeah,
Aaron didn't strike the rock.
And Aaron, so we connect why Moses couldn't go into the promised land because he struck the rock when God didn't tell him to. And then some people even connect it to how harshly he dealt with Israel, because he strikes the rock and he goes, "You rebellious, wicked people," and he's like yelling at them. So they'll be like, well, that's why Moses can't go. But it's not really said why he can't go, other than God just says, you did not believe. You and Aaron are not to enter in.
Did I believe, did not regard my name as holy.
Yeah.
Right? And so there's unbelief. the striking rock may very well have been the occasion where that happened. We don't know when it happened. Like when was this unbelief? It just doesn't say. It just doesn't say, right? You can only speculate. But it says, because you did not believe. And it's to both Aaron and Moses. So something's going on there. Now, who was Abraham's son, the promised son that he finally had? Isaac, right? So he had Isaac, and then Isaac had some sons, right? All right, who were they?
Jacob and Esau.
Yeah, Jacob and Esau. And we know that Jacob is the one through whom the promised seed is going to come. Esau, or Jacob I love, Esau I hated. Now that isn't, again, this is it is not saying that God hates Esau as if, that word hate. It is a,
You're gonna point at somebody you hated?
I was trying to find somebody. He's not here though, so I'm just kidding. It's just talking about this election through whom God is going to bring the promised seed. We know it's through Jacob. And then Jacob has some sons, right? Can you guys name all those? It's a bunch of them. How many of them were there? 12. Okay, that's a good.
Dan, Levi.
Keep going.
I want them in order from oldest to youngest.
Dasher and Prancer. Oh, he's saying the order.
Did you say Issachar?
Issachar.
Yeah. Someone say Zebulun. Back there. We get Gad.
Naphtali.
Gad.
Manasseh.
Did anybody say the?
He's Joseph's son.
Oh, that's right.
So we had Joseph, Benjamin. I think that's all of them. So in order from oldest to youngest would be Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. And so Joseph and Benjamin are the sons of Rachel. Right? And when you go through the narrative, this is why Jacob kind of has a special spot for Joseph and Benjamin. And we see towards the end of Exodus, when Joseph, who is in Pharaoh's cart, requests his brothers to bring Benjamin to them, Jacob is just like distraught, right? And Jacob's like, no, let me take him. If anything happens to him, then you can kill me, essentially. And then they end up going. But so those are the sons, right? And we've already shared the story of Joseph and his rise. We see towards the end of Genesis when Jacob dies and all of Jacob's household is in Egypt. Jacob's brothers are afraid, right? Because they think that the only reason Joseph hasn't done anything to his brothers in terms of retribution for selling him to slavery is because, Jacob's living. Now that Jacob's dead, they think that he's going to do something, right? And so in Genesis 50:15, it says, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong which we did to him? So they sent a message to Joseph saying, your father charged before he died, saying, thus you shall say to Joseph, please forgive, I beg you, the transgression of your brothers and their sin, for they did you wrong. Now please forgive the transgressions of the servants of the God of your father. And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also came and fell down before him and said, behold, we are your servants. But Joseph said to them, do not be afraid, for am I in God's place? As for you, you meant evil for me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. So therefore, do not be afraid. I'll provide for you and your little ones. So he comforted and spoke to them kindly. So we see this. There's this repeated theme or motif in the Old Testament where men try to do something evil, or they try to thwart God somehow or resist him somehow, but then somehow through their actions, God still brings about his purposes. He still accomplishes and fulfills his promises, even through the free will of men. That sounds like a pretty powerful God to me, who can do that. So this is how people of Israel end up in Egypt, right? Starting with Abraham. The promise is back to Abraham. And before we kind of get into things here regarding Exodus, I'd like to draw your attention to chapter 26. in Genesis. And you should have this bookmarked, have this highlighted, this text here. We're starting in we'll just start in verse 1. There's a lot of famines in the Old Testament as well, and so there's another kind of theme there that's used, literary device. Now, this is Isaac, right? And so we have, it's talking about Isaac. Now, there was a famine in the land besides the previous famine that had occurred in the days of Abraham. So Isaac went to Gerar, to Abimelech, king of the Philistines. The Lord appeared to him and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Stay in the land which I shall tell you." Just thought of something. I wonder if Isaac thought that he had to go down to Egypt because of the he didn't say Egypt to Abraham though. He just said in a foreign land,
He
right?
just said foreign land.
He didn't identify the land. Okay, and anyhow, it says, "Sojourn in this land, and you will be." Okay, do not go down to Egypt. Stay in the land which I shall tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you, and bless you. For to you and to your descendants I will give you all these lands, and I will establish the oath which I swore to your father Abraham. I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven, and will give your descendants all these lands, and by your descendants all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. So again, a reiteration of the promise that God gave to Abraham. Then in verse 5, because Abraham obeyed me and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Well, that's interesting. Because Abraham obeyed me, kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. What do we know about the law? What do we know about the laws? They weren't written yet. They weren't given yet. They weren't given until Exodus 19. So how did Abraham obey God's commandments, his statutes, and his laws? How did he do it? If there were no commandments, statutes, and laws, how did he do it?
Well, there were commandments, circumcision, sacrifice, but there's no laws.
There's no laws.
Yeah.
Sure. I would submit to you. You were going to say something?
I was going to ask, how did Abraham? How is it said that Abraham obeyed the laws before laws?
There it is. Back to Genesis 15. It says, "Then he believed in the Lord, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness." Okay. That is how Abraham was made righteous before God. He believed in him. He believed in him. Okay. And so what we have here in the book of Genesis especially is this characterization of Abraham as this man of faith. Sure, he wasn't perfect. He screwed up. But he believed in the Lord. He believed in him.
I like the way that Paul kind of describes it in Romans regarding Abraham. Is that he basically said that Abraham was fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised.
Right.
And that's the thrust of it there, is that Abraham had this confidence and trust in God being able to do what he said he was going to. And that's how he was able to fulfill or keep the law that God had not yet given, because he had that trust and that faith in who God was and what he said.
Very good. So, just kind of wanted to set that up for you. Abraham, this man of faith, before the law was given. And then is this where the handoff occurs in the Exodus?
Sure, if you want.
Yeah, so this is where we find ourselves with the people of Israel. They're in Exodus, right? They've lived there for 400 years, and they're being oppressed. They're in bondage to the Egyptians.
Yep.
He had something to say,
One
but
thing that is interesting, just in the story, is like I think it's a famine type circumstance that brings Abraham down to Egypt to start with, and then a lot of bad stuff happens there. He has to leave, and then Isaac almost goes down to Egypt, but God tells him not to, and then it's a famine that brings the children of Israel down to Egypt, and now bad stuff's happening.
what happens in Ruth? There's a
famine
famine in the land,
Yeah.
right? So
They left.
the Hebrew there, if you look at the construction, that's only found back in, I think, Genesis. I don't remember the exact reference, but what's going on in Ruth is what's interesting about Ruth is there's no explicit reference to God in terms of him doing anything. The only reference that's made is, Ruth tells Naomi that your God will be my God and your people will be my people. right? But God isn't like overtly present. Yet when you go through the text, it's like, again, you kind of see this providential going on, this goings on. This God is working, right? He's still working, and that section of Ruth draws it back to the patriarchs, the God of their fathers, the God who fulfills promises. But anyhow, that's neither here nor there. Go ahead.
That's a good segue for. So God isn't really explicitly mentioned in Exodus until chapter 3, the burning bush. But in the same way we can see how God is working through Ruth is by picking up patterns and repeated phrases, parallels and contrasting from Genesis. We can see that in Ruth. You could also see that in in Exodus. There's overtly, it names the 12 sons of Jacob, but there's other like repeated patterns, specifically in verse 6, and Joseph died and his brothers and all that generation. No, wait. Verse 5, all the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. So why, does anybody remember why we said 70 persons is important?
Is it tied to Noah's descendants?
Mm-hmm. So in the Table of Nations in chapter 11, you have Noah's descendants, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, their children. And there's 70 names in chapter 11 mentioned. Now here there's not 70 names mentioned, but it's a callback. It says 70 persons. So what this is showing is that so far, everything God has promised to Abraham has come true. So without overtly saying this is now a nation that is in Egypt, it's a nation within a nation, it's drawing that back to the Table of Nations in chapter 11 of Genesis, chapter 10 of Genesis. So when it says 70 persons here, it should remind us of there are 70 names listed there. This is a nation within a nation now. So even the kind of, I don't want to call it a negative promise, but it is a promise that they're going to be oppressed for 400 years. So now all the promises that God gave Abraham are starting to come true and into fruition. And then that's what we see at the beginning part of Exodus.
It even calls back to Genesis 2.
Right.
In verse 7. So, but the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so the land was filled with them.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the two charges that God gave to Adam and Eve. Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. And so we see that even calling back here now, just kind of demonstrating again God's faithfulness to fulfill it.
Right, so even when it seems as though God is not with us, we can see these repeated patterns for 400 years. God was silent, but you can see that He's working through, like His providence is working through His people. So then the other thing I wanted to say about the introduction is like kind of Exodus as a whole, the Pentateuch as a whole, going back to this comparison between Abraham and Moses, someone who lived before the law was accredited righteous. He was a righteous person through faith. It was obedience of the law, even though there was no law. So through faith, he was reckoned righteous. And then you have Moses, who delivered God's law to God's people, is said to have not believed and wasn't able to get into the promised land. So if you're making a comparison of two people, one of them's considered righteous, and one of them died before he died in the wilderness, then the one who's reckoned righteous is going to be the one we should follow, not Moses. And you can see Moses struggling with God starting in chapter 3. Something very significant happens in chapter 4 that we haven't got to yet, but I'll give a spoiler. Moses is arguing with God.
Call it a teaser.
Yeah. Moses is arguing with God back and forth. Who am I? God's like, it doesn't matter who you are, I'm with you. Like, well, I can't talk that well. He's like, who made your mouth? But anyway, God even gives him a concession. It's like, fine, just take Aaron. And then Moses is flat out like, I just don't want to go. He doesn't have any more excuses. He's just, I just don't want to go. So then it says that God gets angry at Moses. Like his anger burned towards Moses. That is the first time in the Bible where it said that God got angry. That's the first mention of God's anger in the Pentateuch. Which is really interesting because what happens in Genesis chapter 6? He floods the whole world.
Oh, yeah.
He destroys the whole world. But it's never said, God's never said to be angry. It's only through Moses' lack of faith, his disbelief, that's when God's anger burns towards Moses. And then you have, like Levi said earlier, you kind of have Moses struggling with God, like not believing, not being faithful, not having faith. But then you see the complete opposite with the Israelites. They believe Moses. They trust in God through Moses. So all the way through up until Exodus 19, which is going to be a huge chapter when we get to it, faith is always mentioned in a positive sense. Well, not always, but faith is mentioned in a positive sense throughout the beginning of the Pentateuch until Exodus 19, when it says the Israelites did not believe. And after chapter 19, faith is never used in a positive sense for the rest of the Pentateuch, not just the rest of Exodus. For the entirety of Moses' the rest that he writes, faith is never mentioned in a positive sense again.
That's not to say that faith is no longer positive. It's still positive. It's just that there's only unbelief.
Right.
There's only unbelief.
The author chose to only present it in a negative
Yeah.
aspect.
So they say, where before it was like Israel believed. You know, Abraham believed. Now it's Moses did not believe. The Israelites did not believe. You know, that's what you say. You never hear believe anymore without it being negative. Someone so-and-so did not believe. I think that's it for that.
Just to touch that on the parallel studies that we've been doing in Matthew, I think that's the difference between Moses and Christ, right? That when the journey through the wilderness was a test, Moses and the Israelites failed because of their lack of faith, while Christ maintained his faith in the midst of the testing and trials. So that's one of the contrasts that we drew out.
Greater Moses right here. You got it. You got that connection, man.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I forgot to mention it, but that's the other thing that I'm trying to highlight. It. We might have different things we're highlighting at different times, but I think mostly the two things we want to draw out is this faith versus law, and Jesus as the greater Moses, which that's why we're doing the parallel study in Matthew, or one of the reasons why we're doing the parallel study is you can see how Jesus fulfills the law through faith, and how he's just great. He does everything better than Moses. They wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, the Israelites, because their unbelief and their lack of faith, to whereas Jesus fasted for 40 days and passed the test, the trial, the temptation.
Yeah. Now, trying to decide what time we got.
That's
12:03.
a really cool passage because one of the temptations is, Satan tells him to turn the breast to stone, and where God provided the manna in the wilderness, Christ says that my Father can make
Turn the stones into bread.
stones into bread. But he doesn't even take that, just amplifying how much more sufficient Christ is.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really cool passage.
Okay. So I'm trying to decide what to do next here. Why don't we just kind of work through a couple of these passages. So Exodus 1 and 2, it kind of sets things up for us, right? Exodus 1 and 2, they describe the state of Israel in the land of Egypt, right? There's a new Pharaoh who did not know Joseph, right? A new Pharaoh who did not know Joseph arose over Egypt. And then these chapters also introduce Moses and foreshadow some things to come. And in chapter 1 specifically, and Jeremiah brought this up, it details how the people were brought to Egypt. All the descendant of Jacob, that is Israel, they grew in number and strength. And because of this, how did the king feel?
The Pharaoh?
Or the Pharaoh, the king. How did he threatened, right? Felt threatened. And so he enacted hard labor on them in the hopes that they would not multiply, right? What happens?
Population explosion.
Right. So he enacts hard labor. He's trying to keep them from multiplying, and his efforts to keep them from multiplying actually lead to their further multiplication. So we kind of see this, again, this providential irony at work, right? Despite his efforts to stop them, they continue to grow. And so
There seems to be a connection. I haven't been able to make the connection, but from when he increases the labor, and they're to make bricks from mud.
Yeah.
There seems to be a connection with Tower,
Sodom and Gomorrah,
I was thinking
or
Tower of Babel.
Tower of Babel. Yeah, there might be.
But I haven't made it. So if anybody wants to work on that for me, get back to me.
Yeah.
I think one of the strange dynamics in that case with Moses and Aaron was that, so Miriam is probably the oldest, right? She's probably a teenager or 10 years old, around there, 12, right? Because she's watching him when this is going on, and remember the Pharaoh is like this, he says to kill all the male children. Well, Aaron was already alive. He was being hidden because he's about 3 years older than Moses, and so it made for a strange dynamic in that home, having to give up one of your children. So you have one that's being hidden already, and then Moses is put in the river, and he's the younger one. And so you see the younger always being used by God.
It's interesting.
That lineage, right?
Yeah.
Jacob, it happens to Jacob. It happens.
David.
That's right. It happens with
Joseph.
the kids of Joseph, right? Manasseh, and so God. He chose
Isaac.
Israel too, right,
Yeah.
as a son, not because they were great in number, but because they were weaker. And so there's a correlation in the New Testament when that starts happening, where God doesn't choose great men. He doesn't choose the rich, the powerful. He chooses fishermen, ordinary people, broken people. And again, when the church starts being persecuted, as in the case with Israel, what happens? Well, the gospel spread throughout the whole Roman Empire.
Yeah. We see that in Philippians.
Yeah, and so that's God's promise is that in weakness, my strength is perfected.
Yeah.
I think you also see, you're talking about the providential irony of it.
Yeah.
Pharaoh's plan. It was a two-part plan basically. Kill the male children and let the daughters live.
Yeah.
And then the other part was throw the male children to the Nile. Well, Moses, was thrown into the Nile in the little makeshift raft or ark. And who was it that rescued Moses? The daughters.
Yeah.
Pharaoh's own daughter rescued her. Miriam's daughter, met her. And it's almost like Pharaoh's plan, or you can think of his plan like the world's plan. Matthew says it backfired.
Yeah.
And God just kind of almost rubbed it in a little bit, the irony of it, that this was thwarted by the very thing you were trying to do.
Yeah.
I just think that's
And this-
interesting.
Yeah, it's also, so I just thought of the cross and how the thief is like, just come down off that cross and save us. It's like, well, that's exactly what he was. He had to stay on the cross to save.
Yeah. Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness.
Yeah.
It's like, well, why do we have this serpent, this symbol, of their death, essentially, because the snakes bit them. But look on this. It's again this idea, having faith. Just look on this, and then Christ used that as a image for himself being lifted up. Providential irony. It just, the text is saturated in it, but it's not. Don't just read like, oh, that's interesting. Like, no, it's there. It's there. It's communicating something. The author, God put that in there through the authors, right? And so it's, what are these things communicating? We see it again. I guess it's not really. It's kind of ironic. I guess it's coincidental. When Moses goes and he flees, and he meet his wife, right? And where does he meet her?
At the well.
At a well. Well, that's interesting, because most of the accounts of the patriarchs, they meet their wives at the well, except I think with the exception of Abraham. But there's also other parallels,
He could have.
right? He could have. Yeah, we don't know. There's these parallels in the text that seem to communicate something, kind of similar to what's going on in the book of Ruth. There's just things just kind of work out a certain way. It's like, well, what do I think it speaks to? I think it speaks to God continuing to be present. He is there working. He's involved in the affairs of men, even when it doesn't seem like he is, right? Even though the Israelites were under bondage for 400 years. God seemed so far away, yet he was still working to fulfill his promises to them, right? I like this text from Sailhammer. It says, God is indeed at work in the affairs of the world, and that despite human efforts to the contrary, he will bring about his purposes. These events are no mere coincidence. This was God at work. And so, parallelism in the text, providential irony, these things are used to communicate something about God. Namely, I think his sovereignty, his faithfulness, that he is the God who is present, that he is the God who fulfills his promises. And it underscores for us the cause for faith. We just need to trust him. We just need to trust God. It's the same call for the children of Israel as to us. Trust God. Trust in his provision. Now there is one thing I'd like to draw out. We're at 12:11 here. If we go to, let me pull up the text. We'll just do this. If you got your Bibles out, we're going to look at some text here. Are you ready to do the questions at the end?
Huh?
I think we're ready. Did you want to say anything else?
Well, I was going to add on to what Rigo was saying about, God using the weak and humble.
But go ahead.
So in chapter 3, I think this is a big thing to remember about Moses is, how old was Moses when he left Egypt? 40. And how many years did Moses spend in the wilderness? 40. So Moses, with all the power and wealth and authority of a prince of Egypt, gets involved in an altercation where he kills an Egyptian taskmaster. Then, his Hebrew brethren the next day see him and they're arguing, and Moses is like, "Why are you arguing?" And they're like, "What's it to you? You're not the judge of it. Who made you judge over us? Are you going to kill us as you killed the other guy?" So then Moses freaks and runs off into the wilderness. So the point I'm trying to make is, so for 40 years, Moses is in the wilderness with no money, no power, no authority. He's a shepherd, but he's not even shepherding his own sheep. He's shepherding his father-in-law's sheep. So he doesn't even own his own sheep. He has nothing. So how would that have humbled anybody? Being the prince of Egypt, you judge a situation wrongly. You murder someone, so the punishment doesn't fit the crime. He's a terrible judge. He's got this murderous anger. Then he chickens out and just runs away. Now he's in the wilderness for 40 years. He doesn't own anything. He's a complete opposite. Also, you remember in Genesis, Egyptians consider shepherds to be loathsome. So now he's doing the very thing that he probably grew up thinking was a loathsome occupation. Like one of the worst jobs you could have is being a shepherd. Now he's growing up shepherding his father-in-law's sheep, not his own. And then God appears to him in the burning bush. So I think Moses very, very appropriately responds, "Who am I? I had this power. I could have done that 40 years ago for you." And God's like, "No, you couldn't have." Right? It seems to say, "No, you couldn't have done it 40 years ago. I needed you to be out here to be humble." And then I drew the connection to Jesus as the greater Moses, how he left his throne in heaven, humbled himself on earth, lived here human, shepherding his father's sheep out of bondage of sin into glory. The same way Moses humbled, shepherding his father's sheep, leading his people out of bondage of slavery.
Just to kind of piggyback off of that, the interaction between Moses and God, his first two objections, his first one is, "Who am I?" The second one is, "Who are you?" Right? And God's response is essentially the same to both, right? Who am I?
Doesn't matter.
And God says, "Certainly I will be with you." That "I will be" is Ehyeh, which is the same as "I am" in 3:15 when Moses says, "Who are you?" And he says, "I am who I am," right? Or "I will be that I will be," right? "I will be with you." And then he tells them, "Then tell thus says tell the Israelites, thus the Lord. We get the Yavah, right? That's the word that's translated 6,800 times, or that's the word that's used for God's name 6,800 times in the Old Testament. Yavah, which just means He is, or one who exists, right? So right there in the text, God's name, His divine name that He gives to Himself to be a memorial name for all generations, is connected to this idea of presence, right? In His response to Moses, who am I? I will be with you. Who are you? I will be that I will be, or I am who I am, right? The same word. God is with him. And God is with us. It's the same promises given to us. Jesus himself was called Emmanuel in Matthew, right? Which means God with us. And now we have His Spirit. So the same promise that Moses had, that the Israelites had, that God is with them, is true for us. God is with us, right? And so there's a lot of application in terms of just what are we supposed to do then? Just trust God. Just trust Him. Now I would like to draw out one last thing, and then if you have a question that you want to bring up. If we could, I would like somebody to volunteer. I need 4 volunteers, actually. Let me make sure I got the texts here. Should be here somewhere. Yes. We'll just go ahead and read it. Could somebody read Genesis 8:1?
Got it.
All right, and then Genesis 19:29.
Got it.
Genesis 30:22.
Sure.
All right, and then Exodus 2:24.
Got it.
All right, cool. All right, Genesis 8:1.
But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the cattle and were with him in the ark. And God caused a wind to pass over the earth, and the water subsided.
All right, Genesis 19:29.
Thus it came about, when God destroyed the cities of the valley, that God remembered Abraham, and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, when He overthrew the cities in which Lot lived.
Genesis 30:22.
Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son, and said, God has taken away my reproach.
Exodus 2:24.
So God heard their groaning, and God remembered His covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
All right. What is there something similar that's going on in these passages?
So God forgets him long.
That's not what it's saying. So what's
It's the opposite. You're remembered.
Oh, man.
What'd you say?
God remembers.
God remembered. It's in the text. It speaks of God remembering, right? There seems to be this God remembering motif present in the text. Now, what's going on here?
Can God
forget? What do we to make of this in light of God's omniscience? And if you need to, there's plenty of verses on God's omniscience, but someone could go to Isaiah 46:9-10 and read that if you'd like. But essentially, how has the one who has set the beginning from the end remember something? Is that what the text is communicating?
It's more of a He's fulfilling His promise. It's not remembering as if He forgot. It's remembering as in this is the fulfillment. This is where this comes back full circle.
That's exactly it. Yeah. So remembered is always cast in terms of God fulfilling or doing something, right? But it's just used remembered. God cannot forget. He doesn't forget His promises, right? It's not meant as like this mental activity that God was going about and went, oh, I need to do that. No, how did He remember? How is it said that He remembered? He did something.
This idea of God's up there just like,
Oh,
supposed to be doing something.
yeah, yeah.
Looks at me, oh no.
How does God know that, or how does Moses know that God remembered His promises to His people?
He did it. 'Cause he did it. Yeah.
Because he did it, right? Because he acted in a certain way, right? Not that God forgets. What? Go ahead.
Just kind of interesting point. There are some theologians and people who are what's called open theists,
Yeah.
who would say they would use these verses to say, see, God doesn't have omniscience
Yeah.
because he remembers things. And so they have a certain view of God that I just think is inconsistent.
They have a very flat view
Yeah,
of the text.
And they don't take into account other scriptures that do suggest and say that God is omniscient and is all-knowing. But they use these verses to say, see, God can't be all-knowing. He's just kind of experiencing reality with us. And
They-
he remembers things as they happen.
Yeah. They also don't allow us to read the text of the Bible in a way that we read every other text. There's things like figurative language. There's images used. There's parallelism. There's metaphor.
Jesus isn't a door.
Jesus isn't a literal door, right? We know that there's images being used. He's a
Use
little
a
door.
verse like, their sins and iniquities I will remember no more.
Right. Well, can God forget them?
Yeah.
Right. Can God? Did you just? Whoop, they're gone.
I feel like maybe recall would have more of the connotation that is there. As recall as opposed to remember.
Yeah.
Recall the
So I could say the same thing, right? Somebody harms me, does wrong against me, and they come and apologize, and I say, "Don't worry, I've forgotten it." Did I really forget it? No, I'm just not holding it against them, right? Maybe if I had dementia or something, maybe I did forget it. But apologies. No. So
It's also, I think Moses uses that as a device to say we're about to switch speeds, you know. Like then God remembered it, and then it's like, okay, now a new chapter, not literal chapter, but like a
things start happening.
yeah.
Things it's a very significant marker in terms of a narrative break, right? Because then you get to the next part of the narrative, like events start taking place.
And the
after
one-
that.
This kind of like as an aside, but I think one of the coolest things literarily in the Bible for me is the God remembered Noah in 8:1, because it's the middle of a chiastic, huge, like 2-3 chapter chiastic poem. So I guess you guys can look into
Chiastic
that.
structure.
Chiastic structure.
Yeah, which is a literary device used in Hebrew.
So you can look into that if you want. I think it's one of the coolest things.
But the focal point is then God remembered Noah. Seem to be emphasizing that God fulfills his promises and God is present. He's faithful to us. We have all the reason in the world to trust him.
Question, in Hebrew, you know Hebrew? Or you
I've
study
taken a couple classes. I'm pretty rusty.
I'm very extremely rusty, because I actually didn't take Hebrew, but took Greek, but not Hebrew. And I had to, so anyway. Isn't it, so some words in the Old Testament are just used that are, like for instance, like you remember, like we know that that's what it means, right? But they just use that word for one reason, like for instance, the word knew. We knew that, the word knew, and, he knew her, and know that it's there, it's,
Yeah.
kids, but it's intercourse, right? So it's like, it's
It's
certain words.
it could be used as a euphemism for certain
so
things.
That's what I think, right? I mean, because like for instance, like Jehovah's Witnesses take words and totally distort them for their own understanding,
Yeah.
right? Like for instance, we were talking about earlier, we were talking about the younger ones, like David and this, that, and the other. We know that they were like the firstborn. They weren't literally firstborn, but Jehovah's Witnesses will take that word and they'll say, for instance, like in Colossians, they say, like, see, Jesus was the firstborn, meaning the first one created. So I think that we need to do a good word study there, because
Yeah, it's just to kind of bring this out. I can't remember the exact reference, but in Hebrew, I don't remember the word in Hebrew, but I remember the definition. The word so when we say shoreline, we know exactly what we're talking about, right? A beach, right? Where the land meets the sea, right? But the Hebrew word for that literally means lips of the sea. It's like, well, we don't translate it lips of the sea, right? We would translate it as beach or shoreline, right? So it's just the language it's different, and some things don't translate straight across. And so there's one thing to realize is every translation is itself an interpretation. And so when you're reading the NASB and you're getting meaning out of it, it's now twice been interpreted, right? And so it's it's helpful to know the languages. Not everybody has the time to do that, but some people got to do it. Some people need to spend the time doing it. But anyhow, as far as I think we brought out everything we wanted to bring out. Was there anything else?
No.
So, two things.
Oh, yeah.
We want to keep in mind this idea of Abraham and Moses and the contrast between them as we go through the book of Exodus. We want to consider these things in light of our Matthew study as we look at Jesus as the greater Moses, the one who fulfills all things. And then thirdly, which is kind of a sub-theme, is God, his name is tied to his presence with his people. And it's tied to his promises. I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's constantly tying to his promises, to his presence. And this is what the reasons he's giving to Moses to just trust him, just go. And he doesn't. And so for us, contemplate who God is, right? He's trustworthy. He fulfills his promises. We can look forward with full confidence that Jesus will return for us, and that God will set all things right, and that there may be moments like the Israelites who had 400 years of silence, where God probably felt really far off, right? But what are we called to do when we experience those times of silence, where we return to his word, we have his word, we contemplate his promises, and we just trust him. We just trust him.
I would say even now, like with the way that culture is in our country and the divisiveness that's out there and a lot of hatred and darkness that's out there, and the church at large seems to be decreasing rather than growing, at least in America. We still, same as they did in Exodus and Genesis, we trust God and know that He is faithful to fulfill His promises, and then two, that He will take care of His own. And the church is a big part of it too, in helping each other and being part of each other's lives. But yeah, it's the same today as it was then.
Any final questions or? All right, I guess we nailed it.
Yep.
So
I was just gonna add one more thing about the. We're bringing out Jesus as the greater Moses and this comparison between Abraham and Moses, but I don't want anybody to get the wrong idea. Like, we're not saying that's objectively what the text is saying. These are just themes that we're wanting to bring out, and Stephen and Rigo may have different themes that they want to bring out through their Matthew study. But I think we do both agree on we're trying to hit Jesus as the greater Moses. I think both teams are trying to hit that as much as we can.
There's different perspectives that you can view the gospel as, right? That's one of the themes that comes out, because again, we can't put constraints on the Word of God because it's living.
Right.
And so the major theme that Matthew presents is the promised king.
Right.
So within that promised king, there are all these old subtopics. There's this rich connection. There's over 100 direct quotes or allusions to the Old Testament. And so, yeah, I mean, we're looking at those points, but we're also seeing that he's talking about a kingdom. They were looking for an earthly kingdom, but his message is the kingdom of heaven. We see that that's one of the temptations as well. And he's like, we're going to get there, but not your way, Satan.
Yeah.
So that's what the rest of Matthew talks about, the journey to the cross.
good stuff. So we'll pray, and then I don't know how far out food is. We're good? All right, so we'll pray, and then they'll tell us what to do with food. All right. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you that we can just come together to sing praises, to break bread together, to learn from your word. Pray that you just bless our fellowship now, and we thank you for this food and for those who have prepared it. And let us just do all things to your glory and praise. Amen.